So, really don't know. And because it's recorded. Give me a shout when you want me to start introduce. Yeah. Yeah. Tomorrow you're over at 7. Oh, yeah, that's okay. See you later.
Yeah, and also
Oh, that's good. Yeah. And then what about Thursday? Are you done?
Thursday I've got nothing interesting me.
So who you approached you hasn't been? Because I thought you went to the university.
To be fair, lots of people have got back to me, but a lot of them aren't available to speak. So
Right.
I have got 2 meetings scheduled with them.
Right, okay.
I come back into my assistant graduation and I've literally got a Zoom meeting and then I got to go straight from the Zoom meeting to the assistant graduation.
Right, yes, yeah.
That sort of thing. So no, so I have got people have been interested, it's just not.
Yeah. Seriously gives us the multiple starts. We've got people join online as well. So
it's coming in tomorrow.
Yeah. We've had quite a few seminars recently. Yeah, you guys might as well get started.
yeah, you happy? Okay, in that case, welcome to everybody here and those of you online as well. So yeah, I'm pleased to present Natalie, who's joined us all the way from sunny Gibraltar, although you're saying it's not so sunny at the moment. So I won't say too much about Natalie because she can talk about Gibraltar and the work she does, but essentially she's doing a PhD at the moment, so this is very much a talk in sort of early days stage of your PhD. But in terms of her background, she did her undergraduate studies at Bazairi University, where she did environmental science. She then did her MSc in marine science and climate change at the University of Gibraltar. And her thesis looked at the, I'm going to read this out to get this right, the viability of an adapted systematic conservation tool on Gibraltar's southern waters marine conservation zone. And she's done other bits as well, like National Trust, which I'm sure you'll go into. But essentially, Natalie's interest is in marine management, and especially challenges related to the overseas territories. So that's how I've got to sort of work with Natalie and Gibraltar. So yeah, thank you for fitting us in on your schedule, in your flying visit. And I'll hand over to you now. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you to everybody who's here online and obviously in person. Yeah, come all the way over from Gibraltar just to be here this week. So as he said, I'm looking at global best practice in marine management and how you can apply that to an overseas territory like Gibraltar, where you face a lot of challenges. So I'll just give you a quick overview of how I'm going to do this presentation. I'll just give you a quick introduction, a bit of background, and where I'm at with my PhD so far. I am only 8 months in, it's still very early days, and at the end I'm happy to answer questions, but also if you have any feedback or any input that might be really helpful, then I'm also really looking for that as well. I'll give you a bit of background on the context and where this sits in the bigger picture, and I will also give you a bit of an overview on where I'm sort of going with this PhD. So, like Matt said, did my undergraduate in environmental science, and I've always been quite interested in resource management. I think I realised that during my thesis, I did sort of look at, for my master's, it was looking at a tool that you could use on for characterisation. There were a lot of holes in it. It was sort of more of a pilot, a bit of a springboard into my PhD. You know, I identified a lot of things which could be, where it was more gaps. I thought actually I could fill that with my PhD. So when Awantha, my supervisor, said to me, do you fancy staying and do you fancy turning into a PhD? And I said, yes, please, I would love to. So thanks to both Matt and to Awantha for that. So, like I said, I'm only 8 months in, so what I wanted to start by doing was identifying global conservation and marine management good practice around the world. This started with more of an overview. I wanted to see exactly I just wanted to get an overview of what tools were being used. I didn't go into huge depth on how successful they were, but I wanted to identify things that also might limit or threaten those types of marine management strategies. And then I will progress to looking at identifying good practice, and then how can you apply this and adapt this good practice to Gibraltar. There is a big problem in that a lot of tools are used in many other places. You know, you have say the management strategy for the Great Barrier Reef is not going to be applicable in Gibraltar in any way, shape or form. So you've got to identify what is actually feasible under the limitations that we have. So my aims were or are to assess the global and overseas territory use of marine conservation, which tools. I've already identified systematic conservation tools as my main focus. I think this is because they tend to be, well, if you've got no sort of system to it, you've got no organisation, your conservation is kind of all over the place. It's not going to be as successful as if you have it a bit more organised. Also, I want to look at the support provided by other tools. So what feeds into this? Is this your monitoring programs? Is this your stakeholder engagement, your community projects? Because especially in places like Gibraltar, you can actually do a lot of citizen science, which will always feed into better practice. Then I want to evaluate the consistency and adaptability of these tools, and like I said, apply that to Gibraltar. So I started out, I needed to do my literature reviews. I already completed my global use of conservation's literature review. That's been published. I adapted it firstly for in reference to the Mediterranean as a whole, and that actually got published earlier this year. I currently have another publication under review at Frontiers in Marine Science, looking at the findings in relation to Gibraltar, because depending on how you can kind of look at the data as a whole, or you can apply it to just Gibraltar. Then I'm going to conduct a review looking at systematic conservation tools. I want to look at especially things like cumulative impacts, pressure state response frameworks, ecosystem-based management. And then I want to look at systematic conservation tool use in overseas territories, and I will talk a bit more about that later because I'm currently in the process of doing that. I also want to identify a way in which historical and recent marine data can be collected in a central source database. There's not a lot of data in Gibraltar, but it is out there. The problem is it's quite fragmented. It's a lot of, for example, there's quite a lot of diving footage, but that's all on memory sticks of divers. They leave it at home. It's not doing anything. It's just sat there in some sort of data form and not being used. It's not being analysed. There's quite a lot to draw on from that. There's also quite a lot of data from the Gibraltar Ornithological Society as well, and they have years and years and years worth of data on seabirds, but again, it's not being fed into anything to support the bigger picture. And then finally, I will develop a tool to facilitate marine conservation. It will be industry focused and it will be more for stakeholder use. This is because in Gibraltar, the marine environment is quite heavily used, and I think management it's not bad at the minute, but it could be better. So, like I said, did the first literature review. I reviewed the global literature on marine protection. Then I identified which tools were being used and broke that down into categories. The categories were quite broad. They could be broken down a lot further, but to do that, you could break them down forever. So I had to draw a line somewhere. And while I was doing that, I also wanted to look at all of the factors that were mentioned that affect success protection. But having said that, that doesn't always mean that the level of influence was discussed. The success of the tools was not always discussed. This is a very zoomed out picture of what is going on. My second literature review is doing something similar, but I also want to look at other elements such as where does the funding come from for overseas territories? Often it doesn't come from internal funding. Often it's things like Blue Belt program or Darwin Plus. It's not actually internal, and a lot of overseas territories don't actually have the funding necessarily themselves to carry out these, long-term monitoring programs, because, I mean, you're probably all very aware, it takes a lot of money to maintain that and a lot of resources. I also want to look at which monitoring programs they have. Like, are they consistent? Are they long-term? How far do they go back? Is it just an inventory? I'm looking at the literature now, and there's inventory after inventory after inventory, but that doesn't tell you anything about the current status. It doesn't, I mean, we've got an inventory, UNIS classes the rocky reef habitat in Gibraltar as healthy, but that's based on old data. In the last 5 years, Rugalopteryx, the invasive brown algae, has swept across Gibraltar's waters and is currently taking over the rocky reef. So is it still healthy? That's in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, yes. Now, maybe not. I also want to know who's responsible. Is it the government that's responsible? Is it NGOs? Is it charities? Is it students from the UK who want to go on a trip over there and do some research? I want to know everything. I think this is quite a good example. So recently we got funding for a rewilding project on Windmill Flats in Gibraltar. So it's a large area of scrublands. They want to restore it for birds, especially Barbary partridge, which we have, which is endemic to Gibraltar. It's funded by Darwin Plus, but we've only got 10 months worth of funding, and we're already having to scratch elements off, such as eDNA and other types of monitoring, because we don't have enough funding to do more. It would be great if we could do more. We could get a really good picture, but we've only got 10 months worth of funding, and we're going to have to limit it to the most important things we've identified. So I'll just go into kind of what the findings of my global conservation review was. Like I said, I wanted to know what types are used around the world, how successful are they, and what influences their success. I ended up with about 207 articles. There were four main categories. They were fairly obvious. You've got your spatial tools, that's your MPAs, zoning within those MPAs or MPA networks. Standardized evaluation, this category could be broken down so far, but you have to draw a line somewhere. And so this includes things like your pressure state response models, ecosystem-based management, systematic conservation planning, any scenario modeling, climate modeling, GIS, anything that has some level of standardization and consistency. Policy and legislation, that's fairly self-explanatory. Also socioeconomic incentive. I think it's been a more common focus these days to get stakeholders engaged and involved in the process, and it tends to be more successful if you do. So there were quite a number of these. So as you can see, and I'll use the pointer, the international policy and legislation and regulation, that was the most commonly cited tool used. Shouldn't come as a surprise, really. A lot of the literature actually comes out of Europe as well. So a lot of it would be, they talk about, say, the Habitats Directive or the Marine Strategy Frameworks Directive. It was more often than not, it was a mention. It wouldn't say how successful that legislation is. It wouldn't say whether the country in question was complying with it or whether it was meeting the objectives that had been set. It was all just sort of, it was tended to be a mention that they had to comply with X, Y, and Z. Also, standardized management evaluation, that came out quite high as well, but this tended to vary from country to country. A lot of them have frameworks in place, but for example, often the outcomes would be similar, but the objectives and the strategies within that they were taking to get to that outcome varied. So there's not a lot of consistency, and they all have different acronyms, different names. It goes on forever. For spatial, marine reserve designation was one of the most popular. Lots of literature discussed. We have MPAs. Again, did not discuss the success, did not say how successful they are, and obviously recent thing is paper parks. Is it actually doing its job, or is it just designated to hit a target, to look like you're doing something? Is it actually working? And then for socioeconomic incentive, again, like I said, stakeholder engagement and involving the local community was actually really useful. The ones that actually did discuss success tended to be the papers that were talking about stakeholder engagement. Similarly, raising awareness also really helped. But I just thought it'd be good for you to see which countries actually came out on top. Australia and the US actually had the most amount of literature. Again, probably because they got a lot of funding, a lot of research. Australia, a lot of the research was in relation to the Great Barrier Reef and their management programs there. The US, similarly, talked a lot about Florida Keys. That seems to be their main one, where most of the research comes out of. But they also talked more about fisheries than some of the others. The one I thought was interesting was Kenya. This was because it seemed to be that most of the literature talking about marine protected areas in Kenya is because of the Mombasa Marine Park, which is one of the oldest in the world. And so there was a lot of research. I think you get an accumulation of research over time. There might be more research coming out of other countries now, but they've got to sort of catch up with the backlog. Also, they talked a lot about marine spatial planning and intercoastal zone management. I think there seems to be a lot of coastal development going on there, and so they are looking at better ways to manage that. The UK had quite a mix, talked about everything from marine protected areas to management plans to monitoring. They covered it all, which was quite nice. The Philippines, I thought this one was a really interesting one, that there was a lot of literature, and this is where most of the community-based project literature came out of. They've done a lot of work with local communities to take on management themselves and decentralized governance to look after the marine protected areas themselves, and they get the benefit from tourism. They might have to give up subsistence fishing to support themselves, but they get an income from the tourism instead, and that seems to be working quite well. As you can see, there's quite a few places which don't have a lot of literature. The west coast of Africa didn't have a lot. This could be because there's not a lot of research being done there. There's not a lot of, and also in the Mediterranean as well, there's not a lot come out of there. There could be a number of reasons for this. Sometimes it could be because they're not translated into English. But I don't think, I think in the Mediterranean this could be partially the case, but also other papers have discussed that there is a lack of data and research going on in the Mediterranean in comparison to the rest of the world. It's going on, but it could be more. So I identified systematic conservation tools as the one that I thought was the most important and what I wanted to build upon. Like I said, it varies between countries. There's not a lot of consistency. So trying to find the models that best fit Gibraltar is going to be a big task because I'm going to have to sift through a lot. Also, they're usually supported by big monitoring programs, which we also don't have the capacity for in Gibraltar at the moment. I also wanted to look at factors. So I came out with 6 different factors. 6 different categories of factors. You've got your socioeconomic factors, which are influenced by the local community. That is pressures applied in case of coastal development. This is quite an issue in Gibraltar. We're spreading out into the ocean quite fast, trying to reclaim land. There's also the in cases where you've got poorer communities where maybe they are, subsistence fishing, they aren't able to give that up. So you can't just go and impose fishing bans on them. There's also the socioeconomic factors applied by industry. That is your shipping, your tourism, and your economic, that is lack of resources and funding. Biophysical, so with the failures due to biological and physical pressures, there are some that you could argue fit in other categories. The categories, there was a bit of grey area between them. It doesn't really influence the outcome. You still get the same sort of results at the end. It's just they're not necessarily in the categories that all people would agree with. These are my categories. This is how I thought it fitted best. Governance, you got your failures from insufficiencies where a lot of, if you've got a lot of top-down management, and sometimes it doesn't always filter down, or people aren't communicating within government or within the overall management team. And finally, you've got your spatial failures. So is it too big? Is it too small? Is it too far away from others? That kind of thing. I wanted to include this image. This is a map from 2013, so it is outdated, but at the same time, it still paints the same picture as it would if you were to look at it today. You can see the ratio of amount of fishing in the Mediterranean versus the size of it overall, it's quite a lot. And there is literature from more recently where it says that the Mediterranean is really quite overexploited as a whole, and Gibraltar is part of that, so I wanted to include that. So of the factors, commercial fishing came out on top. That was the biggest impacting factor, but also coastal development. Like I said, land reclamation, especially in the Mediterranean and in Kenya and on the east coast of Africa. Also in India, there was a lot of where they're having to build out into the sea. Tourism, especially in it seemed to be that tourism, although it's not a worldwide issue, where it does happen, the impacts are really quite great. Pollution, there is a difference between pollution and contamination, but most of the literature I read talked more about pollution as a whole and was often quite generic with it, or it would give you one type of pollution. It tended to vary quite a lot. There was not a lot of consistency. Also, their descriptions of pollution would sometimes be different. So it kind of had to almost be lumped together a little bit to a degree. But as you can see, nutrient pollution and pollution from industry and coastal development was the biggest issue. In terms of economic, I think economic management failures was an interesting one because it wasn't discussed a lot, but when it was discussed, it was found to be quite a big failing. For example, they would start up a monitoring program, and then within 3 to 5 years, it would fail completely because they couldn't maintain it. They couldn't keep doing it. So I think this is another thing that I'm looking at during my PhD is how can you overcome that, because Gibraltar doesn't have the funding to have an extensive, long-running management program. How can you mitigate that? Similarly with governance, if you have poor decision-making and poor coordination and weak stakeholder participation, not just from government, but from all stakeholders, it's not going to be, there's literature talking about how if you have stakeholders on board, it's going to be a whole lot more successful than if you don't. And finally, I thought that spatial would have more discussion. There was discussion of how if there's not, I think there was one paper that said lots of small marine protected areas close together are more effective than one big one. But I thought there would be more discussion of that. I think this is what I was saying about how, yes, they discuss marine protected areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're talking about the success, how well it's working, and are they actually looking at what makes it work in the long run. Again, similar theme, USA, Kenya and Australia all came out on top. The Philippines and the Caribbean, both of them mostly talked about how the impacts of tourism. So I also thought it'd be interesting to break it down by year. I went back as far as the Geneva Convention, not because I didn't look any further, but actually there isn't any literature before the Geneva Convention. There tends to be spikes as you go along, where every time they bring in some sort of new initiative, regulation, or anything along those lines, there's a bit of a spike in literature. But I thought the main thing was interesting was the further back you go, the more they talk about just designation. Sort of pre-2000, there's a lot of looking at, oh, we should start designating these areas. They start to draw out boundaries and they start thinking about implementation. Then as you go past 2000, you get a lot more designation, and then what it starts to do is you start to get more scientific with it. They start to look at developing frameworks. You start to get more scientific-based monitoring with looking at, say, for example, eDNA or mapping, better habitat mapping as the technology advances. And there's also, I think there's a drive to publish more now. So naturally, there's going to be more literature available to look at. So I also looked at I pulled out what came out of the Mediterranean. As you can see, these were the only countries that gave me returns. Whether this is a language boundary or whether this is because there isn't any literature, it's quite hard to tell, but for the most part, I think it's relatively safe to assume that there's not actually vast amounts of literature anyway. Most of it was talking about the Mediterranean as a whole. It didn't talk about any one country specifically, and it would generally just give you an overview of what was being done. It'd say, oh, in Spain there's a monitoring program. Oh, in overall, they all comply with the EU Habitats Directive. It didn't get specific with it. The only one that really got specific was Malta. Their full management plan is easily available, and they break it down quite well. As you can see, Gibraltar, nothing at all. Out of the tools that were used, MPA designation was the one that was used the most. Whether or not these are actually doing their job, it's difficult to tell. Similarly, regional policy and legislation, you get a lot of EU legislation, or you've got things like the Barcelona Convention that they have to comply with. And then also, but there's a big gap in things like marine spatial planning and coastal zone management. I think it's, they obviously have marine spatial planning because everybody's employing that now, but they don't tend to make it as fully accessible, or it's just, they just don't talk about it enough. There's not enough literature published, and it's not readily available to look at. So when you look at the WWF report from 2019, it kind of supports this idea that there's not enough literature and there's not enough research being done. 10% of all of the Mediterranean countries, or nearly all of the Mediterranean countries, did not reach the 10% commitment for protecting their oceans. 2.4% of the Mediterranean is covered by MPAs, but only 1.2% is actually considered effectively managed, and you can see all of that is in the north. You don't really get anything down here, and it tends to get quite sparse when you get over into region 4. Whether this is due to funding, whether it's due to government priorities, the WWF report doesn't go into detail, but it does say that they are failing. Also, this is a real issue because the Mediterranean is a biodiversity hotspot. Like I said earlier, it's one of the most overexploited water bodies. It's also experiencing rapid coastal development, pollution. Good example is in Gibraltar, Western Beach is actually currently at risk of being polluted on a regular basis by Spain because the sewage outfall comes out right next to the beach. And it is the only one of Gibraltar's beaches that frequently fails the bathing water quality tests. It's also warming at 20% faster than any other water body in the world. And so, as you can see, factors follows a similar trend. Malta kind of talks about it the most. Gibraltar has nothing. The Mediterranean discusses it as a whole. And fishing and pollution, unsurprisingly, came out on top, but so did tourism. I mean, you've got, Spain, France, everybody goes there on holiday. But it doesn't talk again much about MPAs. It seems to designate, but without following it up. That seemed to be the general overview. Invasive species was quite talked about. They are doing more research. I know that there's more research coming. For example, with the Rugalopteryx spread, I know that there's a lot more research coming out. A lot of the literature, if you look at it, it's published 2019 onwards. So there is a push to understand that and work out mitigation strategies. But how do you deal with? I mean, there's programs in Portugal to get rid of things like lionfish. But Rugalopteryx is an issue that they've not quite tackled. You've got blue crab and toadfish. We're not quite sure how to deal with it yet, but the research is being done. Climate change, I thought, would have more discussion, but again, I think this is because I'm going into data from, well, research from a long way back, and I think climate change has only come to the forefront recently. So again, it's sort of having to catch up, it's playing catch up with the research. So that brings me on to Gibraltar. So for those of you who don't know, it's an overseas territory. It's in southern Spain, in the Western Mediterranean. It's quite cool because it's at the point where the Mediterranean and the Atlantic meet. So you actually get a really productive ecosystem. You get some really interesting species that you wouldn't necessarily find elsewhere. It's got a small population, only 32,669. But interestingly, despite everybody being really close to the coast, there's actually quite a level of disconnect between the community and the ocean. Like, I talked to so many people in Gibraltar. I mean, I used to work on the tiller, Morrison's, and they'd ask me, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm studying my master's. And they go, oh, what's that about? And I say, oh, did you know there's a coral reef off Europa Point? And they go, no, I never knew that. So, but you've lived here for the last 50 years. How do you not know? So they just don't, they see the dolphins and they go, oh, that's nice. Or they'll go fishing and they go, oh, I know what fish are there. It's like, yeah, but you know which fish are there that you eat. Do you really know what's there? And how much do you identify with that, and how much do you care about that? They do teach it in schools, but whether the children are sort of taking that in and actually holding on to that and doing something with it is yet to be said. And also, it's only got a short coastline. It's only 12 kilometres long. Most of that's not natural either, I should note. Due to development, there used to be rock pools and a lot more natural revetments. A lot of that has gone. So it's not the coastline it used to be. So, like I said, what does it have that's worth protecting? This is actually a picture of Europa Reef. As you can see, there's gorgonians and you've got loads of crustaceans, loads of fish species. You've got all sorts. I mean, you also a lot of tuna, and yeah, and a lot of seabirds as well. So yeah, we've also got submarine caves. Those were actually surveyed a few years ago, back in, I want to say 2007. They were surveyed for archaeological purposes, but they have got footage of Vladdy's Reef. Unfortunately, somebody anecdotally said to me that they dived there more recently, and it used to look like this. It's now covered in Rugalopteryx. We also have a merle bed. I think the merle's really interesting. So the only record up until last year of the merle bed was a hand-drawn map with merle written on it, and it was spelled wrong. Since then, so last year, one of our master students did a baseline characterization of that, and it's not healthy. It's nearly dead, nearly all of it. But how do you compare that to what it was before? How do we decide why has that died? What's going on? Is it because of development? Is it because of pollution? Is it just because it's warmer? We don't know. There also used to be seagrass. Similarly with the seagrass, the last record of it, the last official record of it was in the 80s. They went to go and survey it in the 90s and it disappeared in 10 years, gone. Then finally, you've got the sublittoral sediments. We've got quite a range. We've got sort of a lot of different types of sediment. Again, none of it on the east side. The east side is all sandbanks. That had never been surveyed until this year, when we've got a master's student who is doing a baseline characterization on that. Currently, it's not looking good. There's not a lot there. But again, is that because it was never biodiverse, or is it because it's died over time? We've got nothing to compare it to. And I don't know how much of you know, there is currently an oil tanker sat on that. It got in an accident on the west side, and they decided that the best plan was to drag it around to the east side, put it on the sandbanks because there's nothing there. And then in subsequent months, they didn't quite secure it quick enough, and it actually leaked lubricant oil, which then carried on around the east and west side and caused a massive oil spill crisis. So, like I said, most of these benthic habitats, unmapped, uncharacterized, unmonitored. We don't know their health status. Also, what species do we have? We have a lot of marine mammals. We've got dolphins. We've got, actually yesterday, they posted pictures of fin whales just off the east coast. We also get sea turtles. We've got loads of seabirds. I believe we are counted within the feeding grounds for the Balearic shearwaters. We've got a species of Mediterranean shag, and it's a subspecies, and the colony in Gibraltar is one of only few in the Mediterranean as a whole. We've got a lot of intertidal species, so you've got a species of limpet, the Mediterranean ribbed limpet, Patilla ferruginea. One of our PhD students is modelling that, and he found that the dispersal is likely due to the currents, and because the limpet is only really found in Gibraltar. But in a couple of other locations in the Mediterranean, the colony in Gibraltar is actually supplying all of the other colonies with larvae in all of the other locations. So if you get rid of Gibraltar, there'll be no spread, and it's their colonies will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and probably eventually disappear. Also benthic species, we've got a lot of sea pens, because we don't have any commercial fishing in Gibraltar, so there's no dredging. So the sea pens beds are absolutely superb. I dived down there 3 weeks ago, and it was beautiful. It was just sea pens as far as the eye could see, absolutely stunning. So if we can protect them, we really should. I should also note, we also get other species. We can get basking sharks, like I said, tuna, we get sunfish, all sorts. So let's take a little look at what Gibraltar has in terms of marine conservation so far. So we do actually have protected zones. Here we've got the Southern Waters SAC and SPA. That is actually open to recreational fishermen, although we do occasionally get Spanish fishermen who come over and fish. They shouldn't. They know they shouldn't. There is enforcement in place for that. Then you've got a number of other. Within this, you have other small MCZs. There's also around here is the Seven Sisters no take zone. It is highly protected. It has. We're trying to do a survey because somebody last year, one of the master students, did an abundance survey on, it needed more data, but they did an initial abundance survey on Europa Reef versus Seven Sisters, and Seven Sisters had much higher abundance of fish than Europa Reef. So hopefully we think that it's doing something. However, last year they found crab pots there, so illegal fishing is still going on. Also, you have another issue in that around here we've got Spain went to the European Commission and asked if they could designate a large area of protected waters. It conveniently covers all of Gibraltar, near enough. It doesn't say much for conservation as a whole. It doesn't really impact, but it is politically aggravating. There's already political tensions, and this doesn't smooth things over in any way. So what do we have as limitations? I mean, like I said, we've got our geographical location means that with the political tensions with Spain, that sometimes means that things can be a little bit tricky. Also, we've got Morocco not that far away. The Straits are a busy shipping lane. It does make for things a bit more complicated. One of the reasons that and I should have said actually, the tanker that's dumped on the east side is actually being removed today or this week, and it's been there since last August. But they had to jump through a lot of red tape, I think, in terms of because they had to negotiate with the UK, with Spain, with all of the potentially impacting parties. So it wasn't just that Gibraltar didn't get it out quick enough. They had to jump through a lot of hoops just to get it to that point. Also, we have funding challenges. So Gibraltar is classed as quite rich in terms of the overseas territories. That's because we have a lot of gaming companies. That money doesn't actually stay in Gibraltar. Your average person in Gibraltar is not actually that well off in comparison to, say, somebody in the UK. So we're not eligible for a lot of UK funding, say, for example, the Blue Belt programme. But now we've left the EU, we don't get any funding from them either. So we're only really eligible for the Darwin Plus funding. So they have funded £44 million worth of conservation in overseas territories, and Gibraltar has only received 25k of that. So we haven't got the money to fund it ourselves, but we can't really get any money from anywhere else. For example, Students in Gibraltar go over to the UK, and the UK government pays. No, the Gibraltarian government pays for their student fees. Student fees doesn't work the same way, so we don't get students coming in. Like we get students from all over the place, but they don't get any support when they come over to Gibraltar. So it's not really a two-way thing. Like we do a lot, but we don't get a whole lot in return. There's also resourcing challenges. Getting stuff into Gib is a real nightmare, especially with the Spanish border. Like for example, Awantha asked me at Christmas if I'd possibly be able to go and buy some lab coats and bring them back in my suitcase, because there's no other way to get them, otherwise we'd have to wait for 6 months for them to arrive. So you can imagine what trying to get any sort of equipment. We do everything on a bit of a shoestring. Similarly, staffing and training, it's really hard to get staff trained up, and the Department of Environment has a number of people who are trained, but they're so stretched doing so many other things that they haven't actually got the capacity to run these ongoing monitoring programs or anything else. Similarly, we have a marine environment that is used really heavily. You can't really scale that back. Cruise ships and shipping, I mean, we have you can see here, we have one of the biggest ports in the Mediterranean. We can't scale back on that because that would hit the economy far too hard. They're pretty good at trying to manage it and trying to make sure it has as little impact as possible, but you can only do so much. As I touched on earlier, with education, there's not a lot of awareness and a lot of ownership. I think this is slowly changing, but there's a lot of tradition and culture, especially around fishing. There tends to be, Gibraltarians really love the beach. They love going to the beach every weekend, or in the summer they do summer hours. So they finish work at 3:30 and then they go to the beach. But they don't really know much about anything beyond sitting on the beach, or they have no interest in knowing. So it is this lack of connectivity between people and their local environment. And like I said, there's a lack of capacity building and knowledge transfer. So we don't really do a lot of the main monitoring, the bulk of the monitoring stuff in-house. And any data is, like I said, fragmented, it's all over the place, it's not really shared, it needs to be brought together. And then on top of that, we have threats. So I've already talked about the invasive species. Pollution, not only do we have the pollution from Spain, but also Gibraltar does not have its own sewage treatment plant. All of the raw sewage from all of Gibraltar goes straight off Europa Point and straight into the ocean, which is not great, but trying to get funding for a sewage treatment plant and also trying to find a place where everybody agrees upon is really difficult. There's been a lot of, they've asked for planning to put a sewage treatment plant in at Europa Point, but they've had a lot of kickback from locals. Also, like I said, rapid coastal development. As you can see, this is 2016, and all of the dark grey is reclaimed land. So literally, well, it doesn't say this is reclaimed, but a lot of that is all built upon. So the only bit of natural coastline really is this section here. That's it. And that's actually right here is a UNESCO heritage site, so it will stay protected. Well, that's really quite small. Also, climate change, we haven't really quantified the effects of that yet, but it is likely to, well, there's been more occurrences of storm surges, especially up around here and up on both on the top, the east and west sides. So this is something to consider. A few years ago, they had to rebuild the beach down here because it got completely washed away by a storm surge. Like that had been there for hundreds of years, and then one storm surge gone. So they had to rebuild the entire beach. And then also there's a risk of oil spills. I mean, we have had multiple issues. So, like I said, the OS-35 that is currently beached here. I believe it was the New Flame beached here, and Federer, I think, was also in a similar circumstance to the OS-35, where it got into an accident in the Straits and had to be dragged to the docks. According to, well, Bethan O'Leary has already written a paper on it. She published in 2019, and she issued Gibraltar with the highest threat score of any of the overseas territories. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are a lot of opportunities. One of the great things is, yes, we have a lot of recreational fishermen, and there is a lot of recreational fishing going on, but there are regulations on what type of equipment they can use, and we don't have any commercial fishing. So, I mean, more could be done to, in an ideal world, I think there could be more zoning, but there is room for working with the local recreational fishers to actually do something that's a bit more effective there. We've got very small waters. It's quite easy to keep an eye on it. It should, if we had the funding, the resources, it would actually be quite easy in the, you know, comparatively to actually regulate. We already have a large ratio of protected areas in comparison to the amount of waters. It's 65% of our waters are already protected, which is great. I think it's a good starting point. Yes, they're protected. Could they be protected better? Possibly, but it's a really good start. Because we're now not part of the EU, and we've got quite a lot of autonomy. So it means that we can actually do something which is a little bit different. I think Gibraltar needs something that's a little bit different to the norm because of the circumstances. You can't, it's not a one size fits all. You can't just try and shoehorn it into the practices that work elsewhere. So that's quite nice. That actually gives us a bit of an opportunity to do something that maybe's not been quite thought of yet. Massive one, the University of Gibraltar. We are trying to do so much research. We currently have so many little bits of research going on. We're trying to get involved. We're currently working with the Department of Environment to try and improve the monitoring programme as is. I'm working with 2 other PhD students currently to actually collect baseline data. It's a massive job, but the university is as good as a starting point as you're going to get, really. Especially in September, they're starting a new environmental science course as well. So we're just adding to that at the minute. And also there is a level of political will. The government does have other priorities at the minute, especially with Brexit, but they do want to do stuff. The Department of Environment are really trying to work with us to do more. Also, for example, we align with the Barcelona Convention. We're not actually signed up to it. We're not obliged to do anything, but we have chosen to. So I think this is also a really good sign. So where am I going next with my PhD? So like I said, my publication is currently in review. I'm waiting on that. I want to conduct stakeholder interviews with the local community to try and work out what good marine management looks like to them, and how can we work with them best to carry out something that benefits them and us and the marine environment. This will also include focus groups. I'm also interviewing and talking with experts, so that's part of the reason why I'm here this week, because I want input from, you know, people who know far more than I do. I've got my literature reviews to carry out, and also I am helping out with the habitat and species baseline data collection. So this is just a kind of general overview. I'll look at good practice, get the stakeholder input, then I can put that together into a tool which I can try and start developing. I'll trial the tool. It's probably going to go back to the drawing board a few times, and then hopefully I'll have something to issue at the end of it. But it is noted that there does need to be a standardised data repository for this monitoring data. It is very fragmented. It all needs to be in one place where you can start painting a bigger picture. The university is pushing for us to align with the MEDIN data guidelines, and we are working with the Department of Environment to achieve that. And also a massive thing is the capacity building aspect. It needs to be able to be done in-house with what we have. What resources do we have? What staff do we have? What training do we have? How can we do this on a budget and still be effective? This is quite nice because this could actually translate to other overseas territories and could be a direction for the future. So it's definitely a good starting point. I am only 8 months in, so it's, you know, it's a big task, but it's looking really exciting. So thank you to Amantha, who's not here. Thank you to Matthew. Thank you to the Department of Environment, and thank you to everybody here for coming along.
Hey, thank you, Natalie. So yeah, as you can see, Natalie's on a one-person crusade to sort out Gibraltar, which is fantastic. Yeah, so I'm just going to open it up for any questions, and as Natalie said, it's not just about questions. If you've got any information sources or any data or anything that you might know about, and is it easy to see if there's questions online, Lee? Are they just?
Is it on the team said? You should have the
Yeah,
chat.
so it'll just be a hand to pop up. So yeah, if anybody's got any questions, and I mean, while you're thinking about that, I've got a couple. I mean, firstly, Morocco. So obviously, you know, it's just across the way there, and then I do know there are marine research centres there. So is there any dialogue? Is that helpful at all?
There were talks last year. They're trying to set up a dialogue. Actually, the book chapter that I published in last, well, I forget which side of Christmas it was published. It was around Christmas time it was published. We were actually working with a couple of people from over on the Morocco side to look at that. But it's definitely a relationship we are trying to build currently.
Right.
But it's not quite there yet.
Okay. I mean, I've got a few contacts, but I'm sure yours are probably better than mine because you live across the way. But I've got some anyway if you need them. Yeah, no, exactly. Just one other. I mean. One of the things that was quite shocking, I'm sure you'll find the same, is we talk about problems with things like, say, ocean literacy, where we all say, well, once you get inland in the UK, nobody knows anything and all the rest of it. You've got, I can't imagine you can live more than 2 or 3 miles from the sea in Gibraltar.
No, I think probably the person who lives furthest is got to be maybe 600 metres, 700 metres from the coast.
So yeah, so you've got a place where you can't live more than 1 kilometre from the coast, and yet you've got really poor ocean literacy. And the other things like enforcement, for example, you'd think enforcement would be an absolute doddle in that small area, but you've got illegal fishing and illegal crime. So I guess I found a lot of that quite shocking, but I wondered whether you could persuade people to almost use Gibraltar as a test case of how to do it right, because if there's any place in the world where you think this should be easy, it should be Gibraltar.
This is it. This is going to be a big part of it. Is I really want to get the stakeholders as much as I can involved, and it's going to be a bit of trial and error, I suspect. But the people we talked to so far seem to be quite willing. The girl who's doing her, one of the girls who's doing her PhD, is looking at tuna, and she's actually had a really good response from the fishermen. I think as long as you go in with the right approach, they're actually quite keen to help. They really want to help. They're like, oh, by the way, I caught this fish. Oh, I did this. Oh, do you want to know about it? And which is really positive. I think that's a really good sign.
Yeah. Excellent. No, that's good. Sorry, go there.
Are there long-term plans past the end of your PhD to sort of take it further?
Ideally, yes. But we'll see. I think it's something that I'm quite passionate about, because I think Gibraltar has so much potential, and it's something that I don't think I'm even going to sort of get far below the surface with my PhD, because it is such a massive thing. So I think it's something that I would like to continue long term.
Right. Sorry, Phil. I'll take Anna first, and then we'll work around. So.
Right, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. Couple of things, like in terms of maybe information, and you've obviously got a heck of a lot on your plate, so this may be just like this is too detailed, but a lot of the work I do is with commercial shipping and military, and there's this thing called in-water hull cleaning, which is essentially underwater lawnmowers that clean off the biofouling.
Oh, I think I saw something about them. Yeah.
Right. Gibraltar's famous for being a station, like a little mecca for places to go. In this country and many other countries, it's banned because traditionally it's just, imagine mowing your lawn and all the grass is coming out. The newer systems have a system where they'll suck it up to the surface, filter it and throw it back in with varying degrees of success. But in Gibraltar, it's very well known that you can get a fairly cheap open circuit cleaning system. So there's two things, there's the biofouling and the non-native species. If you do nothing, there's that risk. If you do something, again, there is a risk of, perceived risk of introducing non-native species, but also you've got all the antifoul paint particles, heavy metals. There's a lot going on there as well. So I was just wondering if there was any research into that, because to me that is very, very interesting, and the legislation is changing very quickly.
Yeah, I've noticed. I was sort of looking at things like build water legislation and stuff. It is moving very fast.
Well, there's going to be a lot of biofouling legislation coming up in the next at least year, probably. It's going to be big changes.
Yeah, it's something that I haven't looked into it huge amounts at this point, because I mean I will start to drill down on which pressures are exactly occurring in Gibraltar, but it is going to be something I'm going to have to consider, because I mean it's a massive port. They're doing so much maintenance work. It's going somewhere, and there's regularly you regularly see sort of one of the students, not last year, the year before, did look at invasive species in the marina and was looking at some level of contamination. So I will be including that data, and I think we're going to try and get more data on that. I think we're working with the Department of Environment. That's one of the things that's on the list of things to be looked at.
Okay, if you want any information about whole cleaning, sort of on the big picture thing, do give me a shout. I'll pop my card over later.
Yes,
But
please.
also, the second thing was that we're doing I've got to go out to St Helena at the end of the year, when it happens to be whale shark breeding season, unfortunately, to do a biosecurity or some biosecurity work out there. And I didn't know if that was something that you could link into, because the plan is that this is like a baseline survey that we're doing. And then the idea is that we'll help them build their biosecurity plan. And if that goes okay, then they want to spread it out to other UK OTs.
Yeah.
So again, if that's a link up that's of interest to you, we can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd love to talk about that as well. So, yeah, I was on a
Every
meeting
job.
yesterday with the person from St Helena government, and I've got a meeting next week.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, so
Okay.
we need to catch up as well.
Okay, great.
Excellent. Right, sorry. Yeah, Liz.
Thank you for your talk, and you're taking on a really big task, and congratulations. One thing was there is a tool that was, you probably know it already, is published by WWF. It's to assess the effectiveness of marine protected areas.
Oh, yeah, I looked at that one.
And then I know a place where it's very well used, it's Costa Rica. And you could also use them as an example. And I know many of the publications coming out from there are in English. So I think that could be like a good place to look at. And also, if you need some contact, you can let me know. I know some people that might be able to help you. And my question was, when you are doing your literature review, did you come across any indicator on compliance with the policies, which is something really difficult for all these conventions and all the legislation political? Like you see, as you were saying, it comes on paper, but at the time of measuring compliance, even for the convention itself, is difficult. Did you find something like that?
It was never explicitly said. It was kind of when you read between the lines, you had to infer, which is, I haven't put it in my publication because I think it would. Yeah, I think you can't sort of say, oh, you're not doing that. But there was quite a lot, especially in relation to the Mediterranean. With in Gibraltar, for example, we have, well, up until recently, we had the Marine Strategies Frameworks Directive, and we were trying to meet those objectives, but we weren't quite. So it's not always a lack of compliance; it's a lack of capacity. But I think that there was quite a lot of maybe non-compliance or unable to meet those targets, but it wasn't really talked about.
No measurements.
Yeah.
Lee, you can't check that. Sorry, I should have been using that earlier. Apologies to those online if you haven't heard the questions.
I think they can generally hear, and this one just goes into the room.
Oh, okay.
Well, you're right. Yeah, so I've got a bit of an interest in marine protected areas as well, but from a modelling point of view. I've done some work with the Ascension Island government to develop a forecast for their marine protected area and look at how the marine environment is going to develop over the next 80 years or so. And I was wondering if you knew much about the forecast for around Gibraltar, if there's such a thing exists at all.
Doesn't exist. The only mapping we have is the bathymetry. That's it. There's no habitat mapping of any sort current or not that's available.
But even like physical modelling, I imagine it's quite challenging there.
It is. It's a really difficult area to survey because of the being in the Straits. It's a dynamic environment. It is quite hard to map. There is work. They are currently looking at. I think actually we've got a camera on loan from you guys to try and start mapping it. but there's nothing currently available. But I think it's something that would be good to do if we can just sort of actually get it all mapped, and there's there are a lot of challenges with that. Also, it's quite hard to map when you've got to watch out for massive ships coming in and out on a regular basis and all of that. So yeah, it's quite tricky, but I think it's something that we are looking at doing.
I mean, once again, you think like, we're looking at comprehensive multi-beam mapping in the UK, and nobody complains about the scale of the issue. Ireland have managed to do it quite well, and you'd think Gibraltar would be the easiest out of all of them, but
in theory, yeah.
in
practice, not so much.
Right, okay, there we go. Sam, yeah.
Yeah, it seems a bit crazy that Gibraltar's so close and yet receives so little funding in terms of, understanding the biodiversity around the coastline. I mean, that in itself just seems insane that we don't know where the pristine habitats are, or the habitats we should be protecting are. I don't know whether it's worth maybe speaking to some of the people who helped get the Darwin funding. I know Paul Brickle from the Falklands, Heather Coldway, been successful in Darwin funds, and also in terms of Nicola Webber, who is a lecturer at the Penryn campus next to us. She was out in Ascension Island for several years, and she did their biodiversity action plans. So it might be worth talking to her as well.
And I worked with her husband, Sam Webber,
Okay, yeah.
on a project for the Ascension.
Yeah, so it might be worth getting in contact with them to get.
Yeah, I mean, we do keep applying for Darwin funding. It's quite tricky. I think
That's why if you had someone like Heather Coldway,
on
board.
Jamie Davies, Awantha's partner. She's a part-time lecturer and she does a bit, but she tried to get a Darwin Plus funding not so long ago to start mapping the submarine canyon, and she got told it was too sciencey. And it wasn't stakeholder engagement enough.
You need to map the submarine canyon to see how much plastic's there. There you go.
Well, that was part. But no, I think we've got plans to sort of put in more applications, but it would be nice if we could get funding from other sources as well, because obviously they can't sort of just give it all to Gibraltar, because we've gone crying to them saying, please give us funding. It has to be evenly distributed. So it'd be nice if we could it'd be nice if we actually were able to get funding from other places as well.
But if you do map the submarine canyons, I would be definitely interested in how much plastic's there.
100%. Well, we've got 2 students doing marine plastic surveys, which is actually quite transferable to the submarine canyon. So once we've got it mapped, we've got the research ready to go on it.
I can't see any questions online, but it sounds like there's lots of connections you need to make anyway. So so just to say, thank you all. It's really good. It's exactly what I know Natalie wanted. There's lots of ideas and connections and things like that, which is brilliant. But thank you, Natalie, for including PML on your whistle top straw in the UK. And it was a really interesting talk, and good luck with, as I said, your crusade to sort out Gibraltar. And I think you should talk to John Cortez, Minister of the Environment there. Anyway, I've met him a few times. He's really nice, and I think you'd make a great person to be trained up to take his job eventually. So there we go. That's what I'll finish with. So let's all say thank you to Natalie.